distinguished guests, thank you very much for getting together today, and I want to thank the organizers very much for giving me the opportunity to speak in this program. I should do that. While they're figuring that out, let me point out that the role and implementation of open innovation in a creative economy is a very important topic. And I'm very privileged to be able to talk to you about it today. First of all, I want to spend some time discussing the conceptual framework. I think it's very important with an idea such as the creative economy or open innovation to understand the concepts well enough that we can measure them, because without measurable output, those of us who are involved in the processes and never know whether we're successful or not. So I'll talk about the conceptual framework, then I'll talk about the role of entrepreneurial and creative open innovation in an advanced economy. And finally, I'll talk about implementing open innovation. So, the term creative economy in the literature often is used to refer only to a subset of the industries in the economy. Things like fashion, design, architecture, where the process of creation is obviously an important part of the economy. This comes from the use of the term to refer to the output of what Professor Richard Florida called the creative class. This idea that there is a class of people in the economy who are creative has also led to the term being used to refer especially to entrepreneurs in the economy, small and medium-sized enterprises in the economy. However, I like the way that this was discussed in the announcement for this conference to define the creative economy as an economic system composed of industries that generate economic value and new jobs by producing and utilizing intellectual property based on individual creativity, new technology, and personal talent. In this sense, the creative economy is a characteristic of the economy as a whole. It does not belong to a particular class of people or to a particular class of industries. But creative is a characteristic. How do you become creative? If you look at what creative is, it's someone who is actively engaged in the process of creation, of new ideas or of new acting. Creation itself is a process. The output of creation is usually some sort of invention, in the broad sense of the word invention. Innovation, however, has two different meanings. It's both the process of innovating and also the output of that process, the innovation that is produced. If we look at innovation as a process, we see that it goes hand in hand with creation. Creation is the origin of a new idea, whereas innovation is the process that leads from its creation all the way to its real-world deployment. In that sense, new ideas can appear at any stage, from very basic research all the way until something almost already in the market. But it is different from creation itself. Sometimes inventors have a brilliant idea in an instant, but innovation is a process that takes time. Many things are invented by individuals, but almost always innovation requires the cooperation of more than one person and more than one group. Some inventions are completely unplanned, but innovation is a managed process that is intentional. Many times someone will have a new idea and have no idea what kind of economic value it may have. Innovation, in contrast, always aims to provide some expected value in the real world. This value can be a new value-added product or service, or it can be greater efficiency. So, creation without innovation is unproductive. It means that something came up, but it was not employed in the real world. Conversely, if you ask whether innovation can happen without creativity, I would say that the answer is no. Some creativity is required in order to make a new idea be successful in the real world. This is very important and will be one of the themes of the talk today. We must recognize the creativity that is required in implementing new ideas, not just creating them. This means that the goals of the creative economy embrace both idea creation and innovation. The point about creative innovation is that it's not just taking something from someone else and using a lower cost labor market to implement it more cheaply. Instead, the idea itself is somehow new and somehow brings value in. This kind of creative innovation becomes more important as an economy becomes more advanced. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at this table. Based on the work of Michael Porter, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which does a major survey of almost 200,000 people every year, distinguishes three stages of economic development. What we would commonly call developing economy, they call factor-driven economy. Then after that, you have efficiency-driven economy. And finally, as wealth increases, you have innovation-driven economy. If you look at what happens in this process of economic development, there really is no established industry base at the factor-driven stage. That means that there are many opportunities to add value to the economy without replacing anything, without disrupting anything. The most important type of competitive strength in that kind of economy is to be able to get to the market first. Right now, this is still the situation we see in China. In China, there are so many opportunities to bring in new value into the economy. People don't really have to worry about optimizing resources. They don't really have to worry about how to change something that's already there. But as an economy industrializes and as it urbanizes, typically there will be labor and capital shortages that mean efficiency becomes a key to competitiveness. So as the labor and capital shortages appear, parents want their children to have good, steady jobs. The people who can supply those good, steady jobs are the established industry base. The established industry base may control a great deal of the economic wealth of the country. And they have many opportunities for growth by improving their efficiency, by reaching new markets elsewhere. At some point, however, society changes as wealth spreads through the population. Young people don't want to go to work or line jobs in factories. There are wonderfully high-paying jobs. Think about Detroit. With a high school education, you can be paid extremely well to work on an automobile assembly line. But young people don't want that. Their parents don't really care for that. Instead, the source of new value tends to come to focus on the creation of fresh new ideas and out-of-the-box thinking. This becomes more important because since there's an established industry base, you almost always have to change something in order to bring in something new. This is the whole point of disruption. Now, in this Global Entrepreneurship Monitor studies, there has been recognized that the amount of entrepreneurial activity in the economy is high at the first stage, at the factor-driven stage, when incomes are relatively low. At the efficiency-driven stage, there's not much entrepreneurial activity. Partly, there are too many good opportunities without becoming an entrepreneur. And then at the third stage, the innovation-driven stage of the economy, people elect to become entrepreneurs because they think it will give them more opportunity, a more satisfying career, and better financial return than if they go work in a big company. This is entrepreneurship of opportunity. It really becomes the only lasting element of competitiveness for an economy with very high prices. If you can standardize a process, the process will flow to a lower cost economy. This means that for an advanced economy, innovation is really the only choice for competitiveness. And we see a variety of economies who've done more or less well with implementing this kind of innovation-based economy. In the United States, Silicon Valley has done well. In the United States, other areas have not done well because it's very hard to leave the big industry-focused, efficiency-driven stage of the economy. Japan is having a terrible time getting out of stage two, trying to move into stage two. Korea is on the verge of really implementing stage three, and that's one reason I'm excited to get to talk this morning. To understand this importance of creative, innovative, entrepreneurial innovation, I'd like to look at what is called open innovation. If you're a company manager, you can't live with just one innovation. You must continually create a pipeline of new products and services that you bring to market. Otherwise, people forget about it. Even in the retail industries, new sales promotions, new kinds of advertising campaigns should be looked at as a kind of innovation. So a company, to be sustainable, must have a pipeline of new innovations. Most of the time, this means you must consider more possible future opportunities than you will ever take to market. You will only take those ideas to market that have the best prospects of success and that best fit your overall company strategy. Now, the old solution to this was to have a very big company where you could have a very robust research and development group. Think about IBM. Think about AT&T, Bell Labs. These were systems in which the company supported its innovation pipeline through its own internal R&D for the most part. But for the last 20 years, companies have found this model to be insufficient. Instead, they're seeking to bring in ideas and knowledge from outside, and they're also seeking to make money from ideas that they will not use in their own business. So they obtain technology licenses, they acquire whole companies, they engage in joint cooperative research and development with outside entities. And they must integrate those outside ideas with what they're doing inside the company. There is a natural division of labor depending on where you are in this cycle between basic research and the target market. we can see how this works, especially well if you use Google as an example. So the size of Google's company intern research and development activities in 2011 was $6.217 billion. That was 13.1% of their revenues, which is actually a little low in the software industry. The average in the software industry is 13.3%. So inside the funnel, we have $6.2 billion. Now, Google in 2011 bought Motorola Mobility. When you see a big merger or a big acquisition like that, that is a problem of the current market. Google needed the Motorola Mobility patents in order to protect its Android platform in the existing market. So $12 billion for the merger. Google also bought 24 startup companies in the year 2011. When a company buys an entire company, they're obtaining control over that company. This means that Google saw what those companies had as being critical to its own strategy within the next few years. Google spent about $600 million or maybe $700 million, can't give exact numbers, at least not from public sources. But they spent about $600 or $700 million on acquisitions of startup companies in 2011. They created a venture capital arm of the company in 2009 that invested about $100 billion in minority investments in startup companies. When a company does a minority investment, it means that the invested company, I think, will have some strategic importance, but not so much that they have to own everything. They're still happy for the incubation of the idea to go on outside the main firm. We don't have precise numbers about how much university collaboration went on at Google. Based on what I know at Stanford and what I can find out about MIT and some other places, I'm guessing $20 billion for partnerships with universities in 2011, which is a good quality number. But it's interesting that the further away from the market we get, the less control the big acquiring company needs to have, and the less money they spend to look at a broader range of possible new ideas. If you look at the 24 startup companies that Google bought in 2011, you see that there were ideas that are closely connected to Google's existing business model, but that may represent strategic shifts away from its existing business. None of these were search engines, right? What Google had was e-commerce enhancement, social network enhancement, mobile business enhancement, online video and audio distribution, non-text data processing, such as images and voice recognition, and finally, infrastructure software for security. They thought these were critical, but they were not exactly the current existing business. So I'd like to go ahead and look at why this is important in an advanced economy. Why is this kind of open innovation model important? First of all, I'd like to point out that what Google and other companies do with open innovation is not outsourcing. Google does not set the specifications of what it wants someone else to do at the beginning. Instead, it's opportunistic. Google is looking for what is happening outside the company, and it's using open innovation to increase the number of new ideas in its innovation model. It's also letting others pay for the incubation of the idea until the time is right. These others are the venture investors behind the startup companies. Most important thing for today's presentation, though, is that Google uses this kind of open innovation, and so do other companies, this is not just Google, to obtain access to a different type of idea than is already being incubated inside the company's research and development group. For years, we have known that it is very difficult for a large company to support disruptive innovation that may cannibalize its existing business in some way. This was first made, the point was really well made by Professor Christensen back in the Innovators Dilemma, who did an analysis of two different types of risk, what he called technology risk, and I'm calling execution risk, and what he called market risk. Execution risk is the risk that your company will not be successful in developing the new innovation. Market risk is the risk that even if you develop it, people won't buy it. So typically, only a startup company can carry high degrees of both risks. If there is an existing market, an existing company can pay a lot of money to hundreds of engineers to develop a major new product. So in the last few years, Honda Motor Company in Japan has developed Honda Jet. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Japan has developed a new Mitsubishi aircraft company. But notice that those are not startup companies. Conversely, if you have a relatively easy combination of new technologies, relatively easy execution play, a large company can afford to devote hundreds of millions of dollars for marketing. I think the best examples are the iPhone and the iPad. Those happened after Apple was a big company. Apple was unsuccessful 20 years ago with its first Apple. But when you look at high levels of both risk, you're seeing something that only the crazy entrepreneurs and the crazy investors in their companies will support. Tesla Motors is a very good example. It's very difficult to develop an electric-powered sports car that has the performance characteristics that they insist on. That was an amazing technological development. But who would want an electric sports car? It doesn't make the noise that a regular sports car does. It doesn't have the transmissions. You don't get to hear the gear shifting. Who would want it? And yet they have a vision and they brought it to the market. Now, Tesla has stayed independent. They have become a publicly traded company. We're going to see that most of the companies get to a certain point, and then it's better for them to partner with the firms. But this kind of disruptive innovation is a hallmark of the creative economy. There really isn't much to disrupt at the factory-driven stage. But in an innovation-based economy, large companies, small companies, the economy as a whole really needs radical new ideas once in a while to keep industries growing. Otherwise, existing industry becomes comfortable with its current business model and its growth slows. We see this with the Japanese companies. Why didn't Sony come up with the iPhone? That's one of those areas where if you don't keep aiming for radical new things, you can't keep growing. And to aim for something radically new, you may have to give up something that you've been doing already. So this entrepreneurial innovation is really a key to maintaining the higher growth levels of the economy. In the history of the U.S., we've actually got some statistics that show the growth of importance of this entrepreneurial sector of innovation. First of all, if you look at the share of total corporate non-defense research and development spending in the U.S., in 1981, only 4% of that spending was done by companies with less than 1,000 employees. By 2005, almost 1/4 of that spending was done by small firms. Conversely, the large firm share of that spending dropped from 71% to 38%. This is not to say that the big firms stopped spending. Their total spending in dollars actually increased by 3 or 4 times, depending on whether you're looking at constant dollars or current dollars. Similarly, the number of patents that went to firms with less than 1,000 employees grew from 5% in 1972 to 30% in the year 2000. What does this mean? It means that other groups, not the big companies, are supporting a larger share of the innovation of the national economy. So the shift is really from R&D budgets in the big companies to the venture investors. Now, open innovation plays a part in this because when a company, a startup company, has a new idea and goes through the innovation process to bring it to market, the risks associated with that new idea will drop. The market risk will drop as the company starts to really bring a prototype or a beta test to the market. The technology risk, the execution risk drops as they actually develop a product that works. At that point, it's often the best solution for all concerned for the small company to partner in some way with a big firm. For the big company, open innovation provides access to ideas that you don't get inside your own R&D group. Moreover, having your people looking for ideas outside the firm is a good way to help the company not become isolated. Conversely, for a startup company, open innovation may be the only realistic route to success. In the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, it's fascinating that over the last 15 or 20 years, you're seeing a number of startup companies that are built around one single drug compound. The investors in the startup company will take the company through phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. But even if the product is approved by the FDA, the company could never have the marketing clout to convince the physicians to prescribe it and the insurance companies to pay for it and people to want to use it. You're seeing television commercials advertising prescription drugs in the United States now. This means that these startup companies have no choice really but to be acquired by a big firm. And they become very skilled at that process, and they do it for the maximum kind of capital gain in the original investment. For a regional innovation system, open innovation is important because it turns this idea creation process into a cycle where there is an exit. Exit means the transfer of ownership from the original investors and entrepreneurs who started the company to someone else, either through initial public offering or through acquisition by a big firm. Exits are a critical part of the Silicon Valley innovation system because they free up capital that has been created. The capital is created and now it's through that can go on to support the next project. It frees up people who have developed valuable experience in the process of growing companies so that they can participate in the creation of the next idea. About 90% of successful exits in Silicon Valley happen by means of acquisition. In contrast, I asked a venture capitalist from Korea what the Korea number was. 85% of successful exits in Korea are through IPO. So something is wrong with the open innovation system when the big companies can't take advantage of the new ideas of startup companies. This exit means that the most common career path for an entrepreneur in the Silicon Valley system is either to become a serial entrepreneur. You start one company, grow it, become successful, and you got your next project. You want to do this over and over. Or the person transfers their knowledge to become a venture investor. Steps over to the other side of the desk and becomes a professional investor who can mentor the next generation of entrepreneurs. It's very rare for a person to stay in the management of a big company after acquisition or after going public. It's a different set of skills to grow a company from nothing than it is to manage a major company with billions of dollars of sales and tens of thousands of employees. We've seen several examples of people who failed the first time they tried. Steve Jobs was kicked out of his own company. He came back after he learned a lot about how to run the company. Jerry Yang, who founded Yahoo, did not do well when he came back to be the CEO of Yahoo. It's really a rare case where the founder entrepreneur can be a good, big company president. I think that the metaphor we use in the Valley is that entrepreneurship is a bit like parenting. You grow your children, and then you should expect them to live home. So the exit is when they get out and they become a grown-up on their own. This is critical in an advanced economy, but it's also not easy to implement. Managing open innovation, first of all, requires excellence at the CEO and CTO level. Second, it does require the ability to identify the right partner and the right framework for every specific instance of cooperative innovation. Third, it requires an alignment of incentives for all parties who will be involved in the innovation. Sometimes this means a realignment of the usual incentives that we find in the process of R&D. And finally, I think it requires us to go back and rethink what it means to be creative. Up at the C level, the inclusion of potentially disruptive innovations in overall corporate strategy is critically important to an established firm's success. You cannot take something new without sometimes giving up something that you already have. Think about Steve Jobs when you look at the iPad. Now, I think that maybe he didn't realize that the iPad would really cannibalize his laptop business. But the company as a whole did well because suddenly it's selling a new product category. Even if laptop sales go down a certain amount, total revenues for Apple go up. Booz Allen Hamilton has done a study of the 1,000 companies in the world that spend the most on R&D. They do this every year. In their 2010 study, they pointed out that this kind of coordination of overall company strategy with innovation strategy is what made Apple one of the top 3 innovative firms, even though they spent a relatively small on innovation processes. I think they were number 83 out of 1,000 companies. The second thing that you need at the C level is a CTO who is not just the manager of the research and development division. This is because the CTO must have an independent point of view. The main job of the CTO is different from an executive vice president of research and development, is that the CTO is talking directly with the president about new technology opportunities, new management of technology issues that will directly impact corporate strategy. The person must be able to build a company's internal project if there's a better project outside. This is hard. It may mean that your R&D people will become the enemies to the new idea that you CTO must have a brilliant understanding of market psychology and the ability to recognize the potential of a new product. A certain amount of flexibility and opportunism is important, and together, the CTO and CEO must know when it's time, must be able to decide when it's time to modify company's plans. The second point was identifying the right partners and structure for a project. There's actually literature on this. Deck and Strong that studied not only Cisco systems, but Millennium Pharmaceuticals, and there was a third firm in their study, where they pointed out that the partner must be able to deliver short-term value and also long-term value to the relationship. If you're only behind what they do today, you're stagnant. Real open innovation involves a long-term use of the knowledge that the external partner brings. But of course, you'll be honest to evaluate a partnership. The nature of the collaboration framework is also important. Is this something where what you really need is someone sitting in a university who can learn new ideas that the students come up with, that the professors have from a mutual position? Or is it a kind of idea that you really have to own? Because you must keep it absolutely secret. But I think the biggest problem is in incentives. Open innovation works best when both partners recognize that there's a natural symbiosis. Universities do not make and sell products. Therefore, universities cannot do innovation by themselves. Universities depend on the industry sector for actual real-world deployment of their ideas. However, unlike companies, universities are free to try out new approaches and new ideas. In many cases, even if that never turns out to be a product, you've done wonderful advanced education of a young person that you can find. So, I think that the companies should see that the universities are fundamentally different and worth partnering with because they're not because they're cheaper, not because they're famous professors, but because they're a place you can try out new things that you really don't want to spend your own engineer's time trying out. Finally, the partners really have to see more value in the partnership than they do in independence. There's an inherent tension between university and industry. The professors want freedom, the companies want control. This is natural based on the worlds that they work in. But if both see the benefit of the partnership, then somehow they can be in the middle. If a startup firm transfers technology to a major, large corporation, does the major company just keep it off the shelf, away from the market? Or does the large company really bring to it resources that the startup company doesn't have? That kind of measure, that kind of evaluation of a partnership is critical at this stage. Open innovation usually fails because of misaligned incentives. The receiving company, the big company, the R&D crew may see the new approach, the outside idea, as a competitor to their efforts. Typically, one of the first things that happens when a CTO says, look at this company, look at this technology, they give it to the R&D group to evaluate. There may be people working on similar ideas inside the company's R&D group for years. They feel unappreciated, and they feel like evaluating an external idea does not value their own creative contributions. Moreover, they may be afraid to move forward with an idea from some crazy little startup company that they don't really trust the people in the team. The people on that team the people whose technology is being the startup company, may feel that their ideas and knowledge are being valued. This is difficult because most entrepreneurs put too high a value on their company. But if indeed the big company is not using the idea, then it really is being valued. Whether it's really being actively incubated or not. One other problem that's a cultural problem between big companies and small companies is that big companies have established, well-defined business processes. And small companies, by definition, don't. The small company is starting from nothing. It's very informal. People have overriding responsibilities. They don't have really clear reporting duties. And suddenly they go to work in the context of a big company. It's a huge culture shock for a lot of the entrepreneurs associated with a new technology. So these kinds of typical reasons for failure have to do with the attitudes of the people involved. It's critical to adjust the incentive systems for the R&D groups inside the big companies. First of all, they should be rewarded for evaluating ideas from outside the company. They should be looking for the overall benefit to the company, not for their personal kind of how many patents that they create are generating value. The R&D evaluator has to be able to understand the original vision of the external source. One of the places where technology transfer fails is when the receiving side puts the new technology into the old business framework. So you need someone inside your R&D group who can think entrepreneurially. Moreover, this whole process of integrating ideas from outside takes an amazing amount of work. What has happened in the R&D groups that used to value their employees, measure their performance based on how many patents they created each year, is that it has now turned into a situation where they're still creating patents every year, but they're spending a lot of their time working on someone else's technology. This must be incentivized. And this kind of entrepreneurial attitude inside a company is often called entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are a critical group of people who grow inside of a firm. They help create an environment in which it is okay to consider changes in direction and new opportunities. They have a similar worldview to the entrepreneurs from the outside. They can understand a new vision that they will hear from the outside person better. And this kind of creativity and effort that's required for integrating that technology is critical. Traditional R&D employee evaluation is almost all about numbers of patents or the wealth that came from the patents generated. Finally, I think that you really have to look at this process of innovation and the creativity that's involved not only in idea creation, but in innovation and taking the idea all the way to the market. Creativity usually does focus on the efforts of an individual, and really it does take an entire village to innovate a new idea. Each person in an innovation team has a role, but there are different roles in innovation. The inventor of an idea often does not see the best market application of the idea. Each role in that innovation process involves imagining the future. What will the world look like when we have this new product available? This is creativity. It also involves risk-taking, and it involves a lot of work. Taking a new technology out of the lab and putting it into mass production is often a process that requires very creative solutions. It involves entrepreneurial efforts by the people whose technology did not work the first time they tried to advance manufacturing. It's often difficult to recognize the creativity that is involved in innovation, especially when you're dealing with ideas that you can create yourself. But this kind of creativity is essential in a creative economy. It's really also important to create a sense of shared ownership of the innovation. An inventor may invent something, but it was the entire group that brought it to market. So to summarize, creativity and creation depend on innovation. I'm talking especially about innovation as a process that leads from the creation of a new idea, which really will evolve. Open innovation is where large firms and small firms interact, partnering, sometimes swallowing each other, but interact one way or another in order to bring to market ideas that are difficult to incubate inside a large firm. Often, these are disruptive innovations. Disruptive innovations are essential in the advanced economy, and that means open innovation is essential to the efficiency of an advanced economy. One must be willing to put aside an old business in order to open the way to a new business. And open innovation requires the recognition and incentivization of many different kinds of creativity. This is the end of my prepared remarks. I have a few more minutes, and I'm very happy to answer questions from the audience. Thank you very much.